Hello, everyone. Okay, I guess we had a little bit of technical difficulty, but I'm really happy to be here. And I'm giving my fourth talk on the Lotus Sutra. This is the final talk of a series that I've been giving all July. And I have much to say about the sutra. The sutra is the teaching of an eternity, and I have approximately an hour to talk about the things that I think are really important. As I've said in the past, I make these talks as accessible as I can to any kind of listener. I know that sometimes there are people that are very long practiced, devoted Buddhists who are listening, and other people who are much more new to the practice. So I like to think that there's something for everyone. So if you've listened to my last three talks, I went over my encountering of the Dharma. I went over some of the salient features of the Lotus Sutra, which I'm going to return to again today and to some extent. And I talked about the underlying themes, the underlying issues, which if you are aware of when you encounter the sutra and you read it for yourself, it should make things a lot easier so that you're not lost in all of this, the parables and the stories and some of the supernatural occurrences. And I'm going to talk about those at some length. I want to go over some of the basics and recapitulate, reiterate what I was talking about earlier so that we can get into the areas that I want to talk about today, which have to do with faith and understanding and a real appreciation of the sutra itself. So if you'll remember, one of the first things I talked about was attachment. And what I'm going to do is I'm trying to make these things less cerebral, because these are all concepts. But if you take attachment, so here we have a jewel, a beautiful, precious jewel, right? Which is attractive, which, as the Buddha would say, causes the eye to focus on it and to come up with feelings of pleasure, of wanting, of desire. And then we have, you'll probably remember the famous practitioner, Fred, who was doing his best, but he attaches to this, right? So this is attachment. And let go, please. Attachments are very strong. You see, he wants it, it's mine, right? He identifies with it. He encapsulates it into his worldview, even though both Fred and the jewel are impermanent. Okay, Fred, you can return now. Okay, but there is another kind of attachment that's deeper, and this is something that is inherent in the Lotus Sutra, because the Lotus Sutra is trying to show us what we hold on to, what we're actually attached to. So now here we have another view of Fred, who has been practicing for a long time. You can see the sincerity in that face. And he has studied and meditated a great deal, but there is still some issues that he's not even aware of. Now, Master Sheng Yen once used this metaphor, which I found very stark, but important, really hit me, something he once said about how he viewed us practitioners. He imagined as if he were someone at a slaughterhouse and he sees the cattle who are going into slaughter. The cattle don't know what's happening to them, but he can see it because of his great practice and wisdom. And it's not just obviously a metaphor of life and death, but there is kind of this slaughterhouse, this momentary letting go that we are unable to do moment by moment. We reach and enter every situation with some kind of a take on it, something that's going on. Now, Fred, as you can see, now you at home who will be able to view the deeper issues that Fred is facing can see that what's actually going on is that he has Bunny on the back. Right. But Fred, right, you can see this, it's behind him, and he just cannot even see it, but there is something going on. Fred, I feel a burden. I feel angst and unhappiness. So Fred knows that there is something deep inside that he's not encountering, that he's not aware of. And then after much meditation, reading of the sutras, one day he's able to reach back, and lo and behold, he meets his attachment face to face. And he sees it's an illusion. I am not an illusion. So you can see even our illusions have illusions. Not an illusion. Okay, you guys can retire for the moment. This shows how we grasp onto things that we don't even know we're grasping on. There are deep structures in our mind, configurations of how we perceive the world, how we look at what's outside of us and even what's inside of us, and freeze it, in a sense, in our mind. So that's one thing that is attachment, which the parables in the Lotus Sutra are really addressing. And just to go over them very quickly, there was the parable of the burning house, which talked about children who are in a burning house and are so caught up in their toys and their playing that they don't see that the flames of their house are arising all around them. And the rich man, who is the Buddha, who owns the house, is trying everything he can to get them to detach, to get them to turn away from their playthings, which amazingly in the sutra are the old practices, the early teachings of the Buddha, of the sound hearers and the bodhisattvas and the solitary Buddhas. And eventually, using expedient means, he gets the children to run out of the house, and what he's actually offering is this great vehicle. Now, the great vehicle is, in a sense, beyond our ordinary understanding, we sentient beings. It is an all-inclusive, positive, life-enhancing, non-dualistic teaching, which we can only encounter according to our capacity. And that is one thing that the Lotus Sutra says. The Lotus Sutra, in a sense, has our backs wherever we are. And then the next sutra, the next parable, is about the prodigal son, a poor young man who actually had this birthright of perfect understanding, but he runs away because poor self-image, because of a number of things. The Buddha, his father, sees him and gradually brings him into his business. And the arhats who tell this story are trying to share their amazement at how deluded they had been in what they were pursuing. So once again, another example of attachment. And then there is the parable of the conjured city, where the Buddha is showing how people fall short of their real goal. And he talks about these truth seekers, these treasure seekers, who are on this long road to what they think is the final awakening. And he conjures up a city which represents nirvana to get them to go a little bit further, to attract them. And they think they have arrived, but it was really a bubble. So another example of attachment. They thought they had arrived. The arhat says, I have done what had to be done. Nothing more is to be learned. But in the Lotus Sutra, it says that is not true. So the Buddha once again reveals the truth, reveals that there's further to go. And then there is a parable in the 8th chapter of a poor man at a friend's house. The poor man gets drunk, but the friend, who is the Buddha once again, sews a precious jewel in the friend's robe, but the friend doesn't realize it, and he wanders aimlessly for many years until he finally meets the friend again, and the friend tells him about this jewel that he has very close to him. And of course, this is an analogy of our Buddha nature, of our birthright. All of these parables are pointing to how we hold on to things, but at a very, very rarefied level. Even when we think we have accomplishments, think we have made it, until we reach Buddhahood, which is another great feature of the Lotus Sutra. That's the prophecy that we all will reach Buddhahood. Until that happens, then there's further to go. There is still a cloud in front of our eyes, which we're unaware of. Now, the next thing that I talked about, this was last week, was non-duality. This is the idea, or the teaching, that once again we hold on to opposites. We hold on to good and bad, yes and no, long and short, ways of measuring things. So if I have my friends can help me once again, we see a dualistic scenario at first, right? Bear, bunny, different, right? At odds with one another, right? But they're holding on to concepts of bareness, bunniness. But when they look deeper, when they see how their minds work, what they're holding on to, they can drop a lot of these labels. And even the labels of sentient and non-sentient. We're sentient. Well, they're still attached to certain labels. And of course, as I pointed out last time, in a Zoom talk like this, it really is hard to tell who's sentient and who's not. Right. So, but once they drop the labels and they are able to see what is separating themselves, not only from the other, but from themselves, from their true selves, then they can come together without animosity, without harm, and actually end up together, non-dual. Bunnyhood, bearhood, all dropped. Wonderful. Okay, thank you. They exit. Now, looking deeper into this attachment, what we hold on to, what the sutra is pointing at, it may seem that some of the things I talked about were very abstract, ideas of sentience, ideas of me and the other, all of these. Whereas in our daily lives, we don't really look at things like that. We just go about what we're doing, and we do the best that we can. Now, what I'd like to show now is a little demonstration of what's really going on in our minds versus what's going on in the world. So I have here a box, a little bottle of vitamins, right? My everyday, one a day vitamin. So people will recognize this. I'm not pushing a particular brand. I take one vitamin out, right? And now I have some understanding of what I have holding in my hand. And now I look at the bottle, and I see that there are 180 milligrams of vitamin C. Now, this, of course, is an exercise in utter absurdity, as you will see. So I hold the vitamin in my hand, and I think to myself, I just really look at it, and that it says 180 on the bottle, but as far as I can tell, I only feel 160 milligrams. And if I look, another thing at the bottle, here's riboflavin, 2.6 milligrams. Let's examine the vitamin and see if I can see the riboflavin in it. I don't quite see 2.6 milligrams. Okay, so this is utterly, totally ridiculous. But the point of this exercise is to show that, first of all, I don't really know what's in this. I don't have any experiential way of determining what I'm actually holding. And, you know, there have been some scandals, some questions from vitamin companies, from drug companies, food makers, food processors of what's exactly in the things that we are consuming. And it's not always what we think. But the thing is that I have an idea, and I have an idea that I hold on to. And it concatenates, it connects to much larger issues. So this has to do with my holding on to my health, my body. People take vitamins to improve their mental acuity. The question is, how long will these things last? Do the vitamins actually enter my system the way they ought to? Do I absorb the necessary dosage that I'm supposed to? How would I possibly know? But I have this myth, this set of beliefs that I hold on to, and everyone does, I believe, on some level. I mean, we know that we have to eat, and we know that it's important to move the body to get some exercise. But very few people know what's actually optimal. I mean, what I could eat, how much I could exercise that would mean I would be disease-free, or instead of living to 85, I would live to 85 and a half. This is just not in the cards. Nonetheless, these are very ingrained kind of things that are just a part of the way that we live. So George Carlin said, I plan to live forever. So far, so good. And I'm on that path too, right? I'm on the way to living forever. However, much of what we know shows that that really is an illusion. Now, let's look at some other things that we hold on to that we don't even know we're holding on to. Talk about Superman and Batman, which I'm pretty sure anybody in the West, and probably everyone in the East, is familiar with. Now, I don't know how important these particular figures are for you, but you don't know how you hold on to these tropes until someone like me, let's say, talk about Batman and how vulnerable he is to kryptonite, right? He has to avoid it at all costs because kryptonite can kill him. Kryptonite can kill Batman. Now, anyone listening who has been aware of popular culture will find some dissonance in that statement, because, as we all know and believe sincerely and have deep faith in, it's Superman who's vulnerable to kryptonite. And if I were to insist on Batman being vulnerable to kryptonite, I could imagine some guys getting into a fight over this at a bar, right? Or if I said that there are 10 innings in baseball, you know, just a little bit of a change in our accepted knowledge. But the question then is, could I call up either Batman or Superman, you know, get them on the phone, and you know, it's hard to find their number, call them up and say, is this true? Well, once again, to the extent that we are living in some sort of understandable reality, you can't do that, because neither Batman nor Superman actually exists. I hope this is not too traumatic for some of you. They don't exist. So how could we possibly hold on to something so strongly about something which has no reality whatsoever? So there are tropes and memes and themes in the way that we live our lives that just are beneath the surface, but they're very, very powerful. Once again, look at what's going on politically. When you hear things like Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, people react to these things in astonishingly virulent and just overpoweringly strong, angry ways, without actually seeing how they're holding on to certain things. And of course, we're trying to let go of a lot of the very difficult, oppressive, wrong things that are happening in our culture. We're trying to include everybody. And this is, of course, a theme of the Lotus Sutra, this inclusivity, which is astonishing. And one of the reasons, which I will be getting into, just why I've picked the Lotus Sutra, why it means this much to me. So let's talk a little bit about the inclusivity, since I've made this, I've gotten this far. Also, I just want to add one note about seeking the truth, which is kind of where I'm going with all this, looking at the truth of Buddha, the nature, the truth of who we are. And it's important not to confuse the truth and facts and talk about memes in our culture, alternate facts. But if you look at the original teachings of the Buddha, one landmark foundational teaching is of the four messengers, the four marks of existence. And those are aging, death, sickness, and the possibility of release. These are encapsulated in a story the Buddha tells about how he left the palace when he was a prince, actually before he became the Buddha, before he sat under the Bodhi tree. And he saw on one occasion an elderly person, someone who was sick. He saw a corpse, and then he saw a shramana, a seeker after the truth, all on chariot rides with his charioteer Chanda. Now, if we were to be overly literal about this, and imagine there was in 500 BCE, third eye witness news that's talking on the microphone and saying we're outside the Buddha's palace, and it's 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, and there's the Buddha to be, right? The eyewitness, third eyewitness news is pretty prescient. Coming out, and he sees first a sick person or an old person, right? And it goes on and on like that. And there are some of us who would really want to know, did this happen over a 4-week period? Did it happen 4 separate days? Was it happening at the same time of day? That would be confusing facts for the truth. The truth is that these are conditions of us ordinary sentient beings. As it says in the 5 remembrances, or five things to bring to mind, we are subject to aging, we are subject to sickness, we are subject to death. We are going to be parted from everything that is precious to us, whether we like it or not. And the only thing that we stand on are our actions. Those are things that I see to be luminescently true, despite what package they're in. And that is something that, in a way, the Lotus Sutra points out by giving us these rather remarkable parables and stories. And one interesting thing about a parable is that a parable is not presented as a fact, whereas a fact, even in fiction, there's a fact that Tom Sawyer is the protagonist of the book Tom Sawyer, that Luke Skywalker is a hero in Star Wars. That is a fact within the fiction. But in a parable, it's not presented as factual, it's presented as an as-if situation. What if this were the case? What happens when your mind ponders this kind of thing? And these kind of pondering, this kind of looking into how the mind works, this is how a lot of our Chan practice works when we work with koans, huatos, silent illumination. We're looking into how the mind is structured, what is coming up, what we're attaching to, what we can let go of. So these are really very important points to see. And they, as I said, having this in mind really can help you as you approach the sutra. So let me talk about one thing that is also rather amazing in the sutra, is this idea of transformation. Once again, the idea that we have Buddha nature is quite wonderful. And once again, it's better to hear that than to hear, you're going to, be the heir to a Krispy Kreme donut shop. It's not going to last, but the Buddha nature is something deep within us. And so we can hear it, but then that's just a concept. Now, the sutra seems to be made up of text, of concepts, ideas. And of course, when we first read it, that is how we have access to it. But the sutra is much more. And by the teaching of expedient means, we can see that we can look deeper, much deeper beyond the surface. So let's begin with the first transformation that happens in the sutra. This has to do with the transformation of Maitreya. Now, Maitreya is the bodhisattva of, he's loving compassion, not terribly different from Avalokiteshvara, but also he is known as the future Buddha. In the Lotus Sutra, he's given this prophecy of becoming that future Buddha. But Manjushri, who narrates the story of who Maitreya was in the past, and this in itself is very interesting. It's like, who are we right now and who are we becoming? So the Lotus Sutra is pointing out that Maitreya was a great practitioner in the past, but he's forgotten a lot. And this comes up in the sutra a lot, that we have forgotten who we are. Our birthright is a little alien to us. But early on, Maitreya was known as fame seeker. And this is quite a put down, quite a way of disparaging a practitioner, someone who is really caught in their ego, doing their practice, their Buddhist practice, just so people will admire them, right? But he had Buddha nature within him, and he had made offerings, as the sutra says, to millions and billions of Buddhas in the past. So that now at the beginning of the sutra, there is this announcement that he will indeed be the next Buddha. And once again, the sutra goes into detail about how long he will live, what his Buddha land will be, and the various aspects and stages of his reign as a Buddha. Now, another very inspiring part of the sutra, it comes in chapter 12. This is the Devadatta chapter. Now, the Lotus Sutra is working off people at the time, remember the Lotus Sutra is finally established by the 2nd century AD, and Buddhists have been practicing for centuries. And they are aware of the teachings, the stories, everything that the Buddha has said up till now. And one very prominent figure in the Buddhist sutras, in the Pali Canon, is Devadatta. He is the Buddha's arch enemy, or so he starts out as. And he's the mundane, the earthly equivalent of Mara, who is the devil, the disruptor, the evil one. Devadatta started out as a monk who practiced quite well, achieved great supernatural powers, and actually attracted a whole host of monks to himself. And then he wanted the teaching, the whole practice, to be taken away from the Buddha and given to him. And he became so caught up, so attached to this, that he actually tried to kill the Buddha on 3 different occasions. None of it worked. And Devadatta was responsible and for committing some of the 5 most heinous crimes in Buddhism. He didn't kill his mother or father, but he did try to kill the Buddha. He wounded a Buddha, and he caused a schism in the Sangha, in the group of practitioners. So according to the older teachings, he is in the Avicii hell, the lowest, most horrible hell, according to the early teachings. Now we're in chapter 12 of the Lotus Sutra, and the Buddha is talking about a past life. And this happens throughout the sutra. You see this transformative idea of who someone was, who they become, who they are destined to be. It gives a sense of the flow of our lives, which we can see in the sutra. But in this chapter 12, the Buddha is a great king. And interestingly enough, to me, it's one of the very subtle, but one of the most amazing things in the Lotus Sutra. The Buddha, as this great king, says that for eons, and once again, someone who's not not familiar with the Lotus Sutra might not be aware of these enormously vast lengths of time and distance that are mathematically incalculable. Right? It's like eons, like 10 to the 23 years, just mind-boggling lengths of time. The king says that he had sought the Lotus Sutra for eons, but couldn't find it. So, and this is something which, if you read the sutra carefully, starts appearing in terms of like, when does the Lotus Sutra begin? You can't figure that out from the sutra. When does it end? You can't figure that out from the sutra because of the way that it is structured. Yet the Buddha to be, who's a king in this story, has this sense that there is this ultimate teaching. And what happens is he meets a sage who says, if you follow everything that I am teaching you, I will show you the way. I will show you the great vehicle. And he does. And this is instrumental in the Buddha becoming the Buddha. That sage, the Buddha announces in this chapter, was Devadatta. So the person who was his greatest nemesis, his greatest enemy, becomes his greatest benefactor. And there's a metaphoric understanding in this as well, in terms of how we encounter vexations, difficulties on our path. We come to learn eventually that these vexations, these obstacles, all these things that we don't like, they are the path themselves. But we do everything that we can, we ordinary sentient beings, to ignore that. So the teacher Pema Chodron, the Tibetan monk, talks about how we deal with difficulties. And she uses this metaphor of ice and water. Water is our life flowing when we're at ease, when we're at peace. We don't question that. But when things start to freeze up, when water turns to ice, this is when we become uncomfortable. This is when we suffer. And what Pema Chodron points out is that all of our learning, our growth, is contained in that ice, so that we ought not to look away from it. This is contained in the Devadatta chapter. Later in the same chapter, in terms of blowing our minds from our attachments, from separating ourselves from dualistic thinking, there is a rather remarkable event that happens in the same chapter. A young Naga girl, and Nagas are the sort of half snake, half human, what we would term mythological creatures, but realities in the Buddhist Sutra. There is a princess who's only 8 years old, the daughter of Sagara, a Naga king, who confronts Sariputra and another bodhisattva and announces that she will instantly attain Buddhahood. This is contrary to all Buddhist teachings prior to this. You don't attain Buddhahood instantly. Not that there wasn't a great deal of work and past lives before that, but and certainly a woman, as Sariputra points out, can't attain Buddhahood because of the nature of her body and the nature of her suffering. This was also received teaching earlier on. And an 8-year-old girl is certainly not going to become a Buddha. Yet, in a flash, she turns briefly into a male. There's a lot to be said about that, but that's not for this talk. But she does. She becomes a full-fledged Buddha with her own Buddha land, a name for her reign, a title that identifies her as a Tathagata, a thus come one, a teacher of men and gods. All of these epithets that apply to the Buddha apply to this new Buddha, who was a young dragon girl moments before. So the Lotus Sutra is destroying our, especially if we're practitioners of earlier teachings and caught up with our prejudices and our attachments, even on very high and very subtle levels. The Lotus Sutra is blowing all of that apart. And I think I want to get into one more parable, which is not about attachment, which really is about the about non-duality and inclusivity of the sutra. And remember, as the sutra begins, there is every manner of being in attendance to the Buddha when he speaks. Not only bodhisattvas and arhats, but nagas and a variety of other types of creatures, the Buddha's former wife, the Buddha's aunt, and even the king Ajaratsu, who murdered his own father. People, despite their goodness or their seeming lack of goodness, they're all in attendance. They all have this ability, which is prophesied in the sutra, to achieve Buddhahood. Now, there is one very lovely chapter and parable in the Lotus Sutra called the Parable of the Plants. Interestingly enough, this was the first chapter, the first thing that English speakers ever encountered, or Western speakers. Actually, Eugene Burnouf translated it in 1852. And this is the Parable of the Plants, which begins with this metaphor of a great cloud that covers the earth and rains on every type of foliage, flora and fauna, but it's talking about plants in this particular case, on little itty bitty medicinal herbs, on bushes, on great trees. The rain descends from this cloud and is nourishing to all of the plants, no matter what their particular characteristics are. And this is a metaphor of non-duality itself, that there is one teaching, but many different flavors, that it appears in different forms. So the Buddha says to Sariputra, you should understand, to Kashyapa, you should understand that the Tathagata is like this. He appears in the world like the rising of a great cloud, and he extends his great voice universally over the world of human and heavenly beings and Asuras. Just like the great cloud covers the 3,000 great thousandfold world, right? And this is talking about the entirety of the cosmos. In the Great Assembly, he speaks these words, I am the Tathagata. This is what I said about the dragon princess. Worthy of offerings, fully awakened, fully clear in conduct, well gone, understanding the world, unexcelled leader, trainer of men, teacher of heavenly beings and people, Buddha, world honored one. So these teachings from the Buddha are directly descending to all of us, right? But we have to keep our eyes open in order to see them. And I think what I'm going to have time for basically one more chapter in the time that's left, but very important, chapter 20. This is sometimes considered an encapsulation of the whole Lotus Sutra. It has this transformative nature, as I mentioned, and inclusivity and non-dualism in not being attached to either praise or blame. Here, the Buddha talks about an earlier time in his many lives when he was a monk who was firm in his understanding and firm in his belief of the inherent Buddha nature of everyone. And he was called never disparaging. In Chinese, that's Chang Bujing. And interestingly enough, the Sanskrit for his name is actually always despised, meaning that he was despised. And this is a theme that comes up in the sutra. It's something that I'm wanted to get to, but I don't know that I'm going to have the time, but about upholding the faith of, not just in this sutra, but in one's own life, in one's own course of liberation. And the sutra predicts that people who uphold this sutra, who preach it, who copy it, who recite it, who try to teach to others, they will run into a great deal of resistance, a great deal of friction, disparagement, brutality. And there are historical reasons that this was actually true as the new teachings became promulgated. But the Bodhisattva, never disparaging, is firm in his belief that we all have Buddha nature. So everyone that he meets, he bows before them and he says, I honor you, that I dare not say anything negative to you because you are a Buddha to be. And he does this with everyone, no matter who it is. And he's born in a time, and this is something, of course, when you read the sutras, there are many different world systems and times when the physicality of people is different, lengths of lifespan are different. So he's in a kind of Dharma ending age when this happens, and there are very arrogant, brutal monks who laugh at him and throw sticks and stones at him. Yet he persists in never disparaging. He never wavers from this understanding. And there's a story of a monk in Japan who seems to have bowed 160,000 times to various people over a certain course of time in practicing this method, in honoring the Lotus Sutra and honoring people's Buddha nature. So this never disparaging is actually the Buddha himself. He eventually got a prophecy from a Buddha named Dipankara, and he never lost this sense of truly seeing the goodness in people, seeing people's potential. And in this short talk, I've touched a number of things. There's so much more in the sutra, and part of what I'm trying to do surreptitiously is to generate some interest. It's really something, but it takes time to absorb this. Remember, even the great Japanese master, Hakuin, one of the great luminaries in Buddhist practice of all times, he read the sutra when he was 16 years old and said, what's the big deal? 16 years later, he read the sutra and he burst into tears in recognizing its depth and meaning. But it does take practice, it does take sincerity, it does take perseverance in order to do that. And as I said, the Lotus Sutra, even though it's seems to be an ancient teaching, it's important to recognize, and this is something I didn't really touch on, but I will now, and sort of in concluding that the sutra is divided into two kind of sections. The first 14 chapters, the second 14. The second 14 are known as the foundational teachings. And what they show is that the Buddha did not really become a Buddha in this world. He has been a Buddha since time immemorial, and he didn't die as it is recounted in the early sutras. So there is this primordial Buddha, but it doesn't just mean that it's ancient and that it's in the future. What this means is that it is right now in this moment. So that is another teaching that the Lotus Sutra imparts, that what we are talking about, it's not just intellectual, it's not just conceptual, it is palpable, it is real, it is of the moment. It is something that we can actually experience. It's something we can turn to, and we do this through practice, through meditation, through reading, through contemplation. Many different paths that are open to us. And it's just a lifetime of study and growth available to us all. So rather than going on for another few hours, I am going to stop here and would like to take some questions
Great, thanks, Harry. I think people already have questions.
Okay, I seem not to be able to hear, but hopefully everyone has heard me. So.
Yes, anyone, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand. Yeah, I saw Mei Li raise her hand.
I don't quite know why, but if someone can type a question, and considering that you can hear me, I'm happy to address it.
Yeah, Mei Li, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Harry. This is Mei Li. Can you hear me? I don't think so.
Hey, Harry, can you hear me? Hey, Harry.
You cannot hear anybody.
I don't think Harry can hear anyone. Yeah.
Oh, maybe you can type in the chat room.
Okay, this is a rather interesting thing. This is a first, my volume. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but
okay. All right. I think I
can you hear us now?
Wonderful, wonderful. See that? Just a sound revelation all in this talk. Okay, here I am. I'm glad everyone could hear me, and I'm perfectly happy to answer some questions now.
It's okay for me to talk now, to ask?
Yeah, please, Millie.
Oh, hi, Harry. It's very, I'm very happy that I can make time and then to listen to your talk. And it's wonderful, and it's a very good summary, even though I haven't gone through the past 3 that you mentioned, but you had a very good summary, so that's really helpful. And I also like very much your 2 assistants, Fred and the
Fluffy.
bunny.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's wonderful. And I know Lotus Sutra, and you kind of summarize very well. And I know I can really see that is from your personal experience. And I know also you are a very long time practitioner. So I'm more actually interested as how and your personal learning from the very beginning and until now. I mean, I think that's a very good sharing for most of us who are still on the path and maybe in the very early stage.
Oh, great. All right. Well, thank you so much. Any other questions or comments? Okay, I see some people have raised their hands.
Hi, Harry.
Hi, Simon.
This is Simon.
Yeah, hi, how are
thank you
you?
again for your talk. Good. I had a question going back earlier about a couple things. You mentioned, using vexation as the path, or vexation as a path. I think that came from Pema Chodron. And just about the dual, non-dual things earlier. So things came to mind. One of them was, how do you know when to kind of sit with that vexation and investigate it before you try to reach out to somebody, for example, and get some relief? Like for me, like if something's bothering me, when I call somebody, it helps me. If I share it with some people, right? Trusted people that I know are going to be there, and maybe are trusted advisors, right?
Yeah.
But then sometimes I feel like I'm kind of shortchanging the experience, because it just seems like I'm a little bit codependent on having to get that relief. And then somewhat related to that is, how much do you use the vexation to sort of spur you on to things? So what came to mind was like if you're a recent immigrant or something, right? You're sort of using, like my parents' generation, right? They had to sort of hustle in order to sort of establish themselves. And in my generation, I can kind of sit
Simon,
back
let
and think about
me
things.
address what you've asked so far, because some other people might want to talk.
Sure, sure, go ahead.
What I think, if you have the teaching of non-harm in mind, that you really have an idea of what your intentions are, so that yes, if you're angry at someone, if you're vexed by it, if you look at the whole scenario and you see that the way that you're going to express it is going to be filled with anger, and it's going to actually cause more harm than good, that's a good indication that you haven't worked it through completely or well enough. And but how we actually act according to what our understanding of the teaching, what our understanding of our own needs is, that is a very, very difficult question. Like Aristotle said, getting angry is easy, but getting angry for the right reason, for the right amount of time, with the right person, to the right extent, that's not easy. So anybody else? Okay, let's see. Hello?
Hi, Harry. It's Alyssa. I just wanted to say thank you for this wonderful series of talks. It was just so great just to see my 3 favorite Dharma teachers this morning, including Fred and Fluffy Bunny. But this was wonderful. Thank you so much just for doing this.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for coming.
Okay. Does anyone else have questions?
Miranda?
Hello, hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Good. So I have a question. It goes back a bit. There's a mention about 8 wins from before, something about success and failure, fame, reputation, fire, water. How does that, could you explain, or could you sort of summarize what this 8 wins has to do with the sutra, or with this whole talk in general, please?
Sure. Well, I don't know that the sutra actually mentions the 8 winds specifically, but generally, of course, those are the concepts that we grasp onto. Those are things that build our egos. We want fame. We don't want disparagement. We want praise. We don't want blame. We want success. We don't want failure. And we want gain, and we don't want loss. That's a very natural, ordinary sentient being response. What the sutra and the practice in general says, that we can't control all of these factors. You can invest in the stock market. You don't know whether you'll make money or lose money. You can try to help someone. You don't know whether that will turn out to be beneficial or you will upset the person. You just don't know. You can only do your best. You can examine your interior motives. You can examine your ways of thinking. So the 8 winds are very easily identifiable concepts, understanding, teachings that show us how our ego is always manifesting in the world. Because this is kind of the measure that we use to talk about ourselves, right? About our careers, our family, or whatever. These 8 winds are usually in the background. And what the sutra is talking about is how we don't see these attachments. That's how I began the talk. That's why Fred was unable to see Fluffy hiding in the depths of his mind.
Great. I see Ian's hand is still up.
Yes, please.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
Oh, nice to see you. I'll try and put my face up as well so you can all be frightened.
Oh, there you are. Hi.
How are you? I was intrigued with what you mentioned earlier about the, I'd never heard of this alternative Buddha, almost like Lucifer, the fallen enlightened one. And it seems to be a concurrent theme. I mean, in my reading this week, I've been looking at Islam, and they have the wrathful Allah and the compassionate Allah. I suppose Christianity, is this the same as Lucifer? I mean, does it come from the same stem, or is it is he the alternative force in this world of Buddhism that is the devil between our ears? How do you
Well, if you're talking about
is he the mind?
If you're talking about Mara, right? Who I
Yes,
mentioned,
Mara, yes.
Mara doesn't well, there are mentions of demons and all sorts of things throughout the Lotus Sutra, all sorts of hobgoblins.
Yeah.
Mara might be mentioned in the second chapter of the Sutra on Expedient Means, but you know, I guess you could say that underlies a lot of the teachings. But remember, in Buddhism, it's not so much good and evil. So more it's ignorance and wisdom, which are more the polarities. And then, of course, in the later teachings, those are not even seen as polarities. You know, within vexations are wisdom. Within wisdom are vexations. There's this non-dualistic approach that I said.
Yes, yes.
So I was just talking about how you can turn around your perception of something that is really an obstacle, and just see what's happening all around you. Just the way if you see a picture of a bird in the sky, most people will say there's a bird, and they forget that the sky is there, but the bird wouldn't be there if there were no sky. So it's this way of opening the mind and not getting caught on the ways that we usually confine our mind.
Yes, that's excellent. And it may be helpful for the gentleman that contacted you earlier about whether to deal with the vexations in a solitary state or to reach out. I mean, it is a very important question he was asking. I mean, do we share the process that we're involved in, which may make no sense to others, or do we internalize it and work it out through that method?
It's a lifelong issue. You know, I like to quote the French philosopher who said, you know, believe those seeking the truth and doubt those who've found it.
Yes.
Right. So, you know, and that is kind of a message of the Lotus Sutra, right? Because what we think is the truth, what we think is falsehood, is going to be a function of where in my case, my little ordinary sentient being mind is. I'm going to be caught up into my take on the world, my narrative, and that narrative is subject to impermanence. It's subject and produced by ignorance. Yes. And you know, the practice is for us to be aware of these things. They're right in front of us, right? But they're so ingrained, so familiar that we really have a very hard time to see them, to even believing they're real, which is actually another way of understanding the Lotus Sutra continually promoting itself, so to speak. And that's what scholars say. That's not what a Buddhist would say. It's that the Lotus Sutra is continually pointing to what I just said, that there's further to go, and just, you know, abandon your attachment to your normal ways of thinking. You need your normal way of thinking to make your way through the world, but you try to do it with you know, a loving heart. That's kind of the message.
That's difficult. And I would also thinking, you know, during the current pandemic, I assume most of us who are on the end of this cyber world here just now talking to you have been put in a more direct confrontation with death. And I wonder if there is an opinion that you might have about Krishnamurti, say, for instance, and the psychological death versus the actual physical death. In other words, you can have the psychological death prior to the physical death. And that may be, you said it would be a lifelong process, but this state of internal death, where it's not a negative word, by the way, I mean it as a cessation of the constant chatter inside the mind, which is an actual, I would assume it is actually possible. I haven't done it. I don't think I think I've met about one person who's actually managed it in my life physically. I've encountered lots of people on the cyber world and in books who claim to have done it. What is your feeling as a long-term practitioner? Do you have glimmers of this, or you must have? You must.
Well, glimmers. Yeah, I have
momentary seconds.
I have glimmers of lots of things, from Superman to Batman to well, what's called what you're talking about is really what's called the Great Death, Da Ce in Chinese.
The Great Death, yes.
The Great Death, because we recognize three kinds of death in a way in Buddhism. There is, of course, the physical death that we all know and we don't love so much, but we dread, right? The ending of our body, right? Our physical end.
Naturally.
Then there is the moment-to-moment death. This is the Buddha said to his monks, "O bhikkhus, know that every moment you die and are reborn." This is how in every different moment our minds have moved. There's a different configuration, yet we are holding on to the prior configuration. It's very subtle. This is not so easily recognizable or even understandable, but it's as I said in my other talk, you know, life goes like this and our minds go all over the place, attaching here, attaching there, always grasping. But the great death is to release yourself from all of those things so that you are simply no longer encumbered, right? You're not trying to get away from samsara, the life cycle of, you know, recurring patterns of suffering, and you're not trying to embrace nirvana, you know, the absence, the extinguishment of all our vexations.
Yes.
You're comfortable in every single situation that is unlabeled and non-dual. I mean, non-dual is a funny word, but there's an understanding, there's a way of being, a perception within that. And that's, I think, where the sutra and hopefully all of us are going.
Yes, thank you. That was actually really, that was fantastic. And I really enjoyed this, Hari. I find it useful, very useful. I don't want to overuse the mind by memorizing data from books and such like. I feel that you're getting into the other area, which is vitally important as well. So thank you, Hari.
Sure, my pleasure. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. I think that what Ian just said really points out all feelings that we really grateful for your talks. Entire series of talks in July has been very wonderful.
Okay, I mean, I'm happy to stay here for a couple hours, but I know it's not possible.
Yeah, we probably need to wrap it up.
Too hot.
Yeah, and as usual, we will dedicate the merit of attending Dharma talks to all sentient beings, and may all be free from suffering and attain Bodhi mind. And in concluding today's talk, let's join our palms and bow to today's teacher, Harry.